Hello, Kainatis. It is an absolute pleasure. We have a special guest from California today. And because he's in California, there are some limitations as well. And as far as I know, our guest doesn't speak Urdu, but that's okay. The stuff that he's talking about is so fascinating that we will actually provide subtitles under the video, okay? Both in Urdu and in English or whatever language you want. So those things will be there. But we don't want to miss this opportunity to talk about aliens. So as we know, as I've just said, everybody is interested in aliens. Now, let me introduce our guest today. We have Dr. Seth Shostak with us today. He's a senior astronomer at SETI Institute in California. He earned his bachelor's in physics from Princeton University and a PhD in astrophysics from California Institute of Technology, Caltech. He's an active science communicator. He's the author of several books, including Confessions of an Alien Hunter, a scientist's search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And now the really cool part, although I would have said that is really cool, the cool part is that he hosts a SETI weekly radio podcast and show, Big Picture Science. And he has played himself several times in several movies. And he was also an advisor for the 2008 remake, The Day the Earth Stood Still. And he's a science fiction fan, and we'll talk more about it. And I can go on and on about his introduction, but then we will spend all of our time on the introduction and not actually talk to Dr. Shostak. So, Dr. Shostak, please welcome to Kainati Chai.
Well, thanks very much, Salman. You made that introduction so appealing. I don't think I can live up to it.
And I should mention one thing I did not say is that we will be talking about the announcement from the New York Times about flying saucers or about UFOs and other things, but that will have to wait a little. I want to start with Dr. Shostak. How did you get interested in science and in astronomy?
Well, Salman, I think that kids somewhere between the ages of 8 and 11 or 8 and 12, somewhere in there, they get interested in something. And those are interests that stay with them. I was interested in a lot of things. I was interested in amateur radio, and we were making movies when I was 11. But I had also built a telescope when I was 10, and I was interested in that. So when I got to graduate school, I went into the astronomy department and worked in that field. And I guess that's where it began, when I was 10 years old.
And was the question of extraterrestrial intelligence right from the beginning, or did that develop once you were in graduate school with the developments that were taking place, that you can use radio telescopes to look for signals?
Yes. I was doing a thesis, and it involved galaxies, not aliens. But I've been interested in aliens thanks mostly to the movies that I was seeing when I was 10 and 11 years old, because it was a time when aliens were making it big at the local movie theaters. There were lots and lots of films that involved aliens, most of whom seemed to be angry about something. And of course, I got interested in aliens, but I wasn't thinking so much about aliens when I went to school. But by the time I got out, I realized that the techniques of radio astronomy were also being used to look for somebody out there. So that appealed to me as well.
So if I can ask a more direct question about aliens, and that is that you were also, or I think you still are, part of this committee that is there to look for post-detection strategy, meaning to say if a signal is detected from an alien, because humans are actively searching for it, that's what your institute does, SETI Institute. So can you take us step by step of what such a scenario would look like, and how would it practically sort of like unfold? So you have detected a signal, then what? How does it go?
Well, there is a protocol, and the protocol occupies about 3 sheets of paper. That's what it is. It's not very long. Maybe it's only 2 now. We shortened it quite a bit. And it just has 3 things on it. And the first one is, if you pick up a signal that looks like it's from ET, right? The first thing to do is to check it out. Make sure that it's really coming from the sky and not just from a telecommunications satellite or something like that, that it's actually coming from deep space. Once you've done that, then you tell everybody. And of course, you have to tell everybody because you need other people also to look for the signal. And the third thing is don't broadcast any response. Don't say, hey, we heard you guys, without international agreement about that. So that's what the protocol says. In fact, that's not what actually happens when we've gotten signals that we thought might be really aliens on the air. What happens is that the media, the newspapers, the radio stations and so forth, they start calling you up right away. And so it's very, very chaotic. And the protocols are interesting, but not very practical.
So are there any efforts to, I don't know. I mean, maybe that is something that cannot be fixed in such an media environment that it would be pretty hard to keep that under wraps and approach it in a systematic way. So have you sort of like lost hope in that direction? Or do you think there are ways to sort of like, proceed in a way that doesn't cause, I shouldn't use the word panic because I don't know whether there will be panic or not, but certainly a frenzy.
Yeah, no, people have talked about that. I'm not terribly in favor of trying to somehow keep it secret with some sort of, injunction that would keep people from talking to the media, because I don't think that actually helps. You have 2 possible harms, if you will, from the situation. One is you have a policy where you don't talk about it, but then somebody finds out, right? And now it looks like you're keeping secrets. And at least in the United States, a lot of the population is very kind of cynical about all this. And they think, oh, if you found a signal, you wouldn't even tell us, right? So there's a harm there. The harm on the other side is that, because of the chaos and the fact that the media are calling you up, 10 times a minute, that, something that wasn't real, that turned out not to be ET, will become a big story. And now people will say, oh, those guys, they don't even know when they got a signal. So there's harm there too. But frankly, I think it's better to be open about it, because my experience in the US is that there's so much fear of a conspiracy to hide information. I think that that's something to be avoided.
Yeah, and I think the model that is, or at least being thought about, sort of like not saying anything, comes from when you have a big science story coming out. They usually have an embargo that until it gets published, you should not announce it. But here, because of the urgency, I guess the situation changes, and hence your caution, sort of like, that it's better to err on the openness rather than on the embargo part.
That's certainly my point of view. And in fact, what you say about embargoes, my experience with embargoes is that there's always going to be somebody who breaks the embargo and leaks the story. And the consequence of that is that the people that are being quoted in the newspapers or on television about a particular story are not the people that actually did the work, right? Because they're under embargo and they will honor it, but the other people don't have to do so. And consequently, you sort of deprive the scientists who were involved of being able to describe their own work.
So this was not the direction I was planning on going, but let me ask you a question regarding that. So let's say tomorrow there is an unambiguous detection by SETI or some other thing. What do you think the next week is going to look like? What's going to happen?
Well, it's going to be very chaotic, of course. And anybody who knows anything about the subject will be, called by the media. And so there'll be stories everywhere. And, some of them will be accurate and a lot of them won't be very accurate, but that probably doesn't matter. Because in the long run, the facts will sort of sort themselves out. And so I think it would be a matter of, well, here's what the people who were behind the antennas say about this signal, but here's somebody at a university over here who, has an interest in this subject. Here's what they say about it, and so forth. So there'll be a lot of, maybe not misinformation, but misleading information. And the public, of course, wants answers to very simple questions like, well, you found aliens, should I dig a bomb shelter? I mean, what does that mean? That kind of thing. And that message may get lost, but that's only a temporary thing.
Okay. So there have been famous cases. There was last year too, but there's, and I know that you've done a podcast associated with that as well. And I will also have a follow-up video on it. And that was a signal from Proxima Centauri, the star that is close to us, and people thought that they had detected it. But there is a famous signal, the wow signal, that people are often interested in from the late 1970s. Can you say, so this was an example where there was a definite detection of what it was, we don't know. But so can you say a little bit about the wow signal and what do you think, what it is, what it was, and what your views are on it?
Yeah, the wow signal, I think it was 1977, something like that.
So,
in any case, 1970s. And it was detected with a radio telescope, a big antenna, at Ohio State University, right just south of Columbus. And they were just letting the telescope sit there and scan the sky, because it wasn't so useful for astronomy anymore. It had been superseded by other instruments. So that's what they were doing. And every couple of days, an astronomer would come into the control building and look at the computer printout. This was so long ago that everything came out on a big printer from a computer. And he saw a signal that was so strong and so like what they were expecting from an extraterrestrial source that he wrote wow next to it. Okay, so that's how it got its name. And it has become famous, I think, largely because of that name. But it's also the case that nobody knows what it was. It was seen and then automatically reobserved about a minute later, and it wasn't seen the second time. So that doesn't sound very good. It wasn't ever proven to be an extraterrestrial signal. There's a fellow in Chicago who's looked for that signal using lots of radio antennas around the world many times and has never found it again. So that's a situation where you have to just throw up your hands, because it certainly was a strong signal once, but never again. Well, was it aliens? Well, maybe. Was it a problem with the equipment? Maybe. Was it an Earth satellite we didn't think about? Maybe. Nobody knows what it was. And if you can't find it again, you'll never know what it is. So it's just a big question mark.
So, so what do you think? I mean, do you think, the right answer, which actually scientists are often comfortable with, that we don't know, or do you have some speculation regarding that, but there is no evidence for that?
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I would have said it was in a problem in the electronics or the software or something like that, but it doesn't really look like that. So I don't know what it was. Normally these things are, just Earth satellites that are sending information back to Earth, but nobody has ever found which satellite that could be. In 1977, there weren't quite so many of them. So you'd think that you'd be able to find them. And if you talk to the people at Ohio State who were there when it was found and ask them what they think it is, they don't know either. So maybe it was ET, or maybe it wasn't. But, it's not very interesting if you can't prove it.
Has there ever been a signal like that, meaning to say that, yes, there was interest. Initially, it was interesting, but it was never ruled out from any other thing. Has there ever been a signal like that where we can really say, no, really, we have no clue?
Well, actually, there were many of them back in the 1970s, but that was because the equipment was such that when you got a signal, you couldn't right away go back and check it out. So as soon as the experiment got better where you could do that, suddenly these sort of mystery signals kind of went away. And that suggests that they weren't really ET.
I see. So you have laid out in terms of how do you go and test out whether that was a real signal or not. You've also talked about sort of like the detection protocol. But then you have a front page New York Times story a few years ago, and it has kept on coming back, that there have been, I mean, they don't exactly come out and say it, although later on they did. There have been sighting of unidentified flying objects, UFOs, or now what are called UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, and that those were seen by the Navy pilots and things like that. I'm curious because your whole institute is Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and here is New York Times front page story on that. What are your thoughts regarding that?
Well, the UAPs, yes. I, of course, have looked at the 3 videos that were leaked from this, by the Navy. And each one of them, I mean, you look at them, you say, gee, I don't know what that is. But actually, if you think about it a little bit, and there are a lot of people who have, because, you know, these videos are on the internet. If you think about them, you can come up with explanations for all of them, all 3, that don't involve aliens at all. In fact, don't involve anything more mysterious than commercial jet aircraft, actually, or the workings of the cameras on these jets. So to me, the fact that, well, if these are aliens, why is it that the Navy can see them every day, but all the shipping coming in and out of Los Angeles, they don't seem to see it. The commercial airline pilots really don't seem to see it. And only the Navy can see it. And when only the Navy can see it, and only with a particular kind of airplane, with a particular kind of camera, I think that the problem is not that they're aliens. The problem is they haven't figured out how the cameras work. So, I don't think it's extraterrestrials. Why would they just come to see the Navy? I mean, if they can come here, you know, our military wouldn't interest them very much.
But then, how do you explain, that the existence of, the part of the story is when it came out in 2017. It also talked about that there was a shadowy sort of like program within the Pentagon that lasted for a couple of years. And more recently, the Congress also was interested in it, and they had a special report released on that by the Pentagon. So how do you put those 2 things together? Because as you said, well, I mean, it's relatively straightforward to explain away the UAPs, but on the other hand, the story hasn't gone away, and in fact, the Congress also asked for the report for that. So how do you juxtapose those 2?
Well, listen, it's because 1/3 of the American public believes that some of these things actually are alien craft. You know, if everybody was skeptical, right, they probably wouldn't spend much more money on it, but not everyone is. And in particular, there are members of Congress who think, well, we're probably being visited. The military, from their point of view, you know, they want to know what's in the air, right? They have a real interest in that. And so they have many times in the past, you know, sponsored studies to try and find out more about these things. And they never find out anything very interesting. They're not actually, you know, Russian aircraft or anything like that. So, there is an incentive to do it again. I mean, I've testified to Congress a couple of times about other things, but they always ask about, well, what happened at Roswell and stuff like that. So they have an interest in this subject that's, you know, very typical of what the average citizen has, which is to say, gosh, I think some of them may be aliens. Shouldn't we look into that? So, you know, there are some Congress people who are willing to authorize the spending of money to trace these things down. And, you know, they spend the money and they get a couple of interesting videos maybe, or whatever they get, but they've never yet proven to the science community, or for that matter, even to people who run science museums, that there's anything to this story other than, you know, the fact that it was on the front page of the New York Times. I have to say, in that regard, the lead authors on those articles were also people who, you know, believed were being visited. So they weren't exactly objective.
Well, so connected to that, and I actually do think, I mean, I think in many ways, the New York Times has been doing quite a bit of disservice at a time when we are trying to figure out what is truth, right? I mean, there is all this this sort of like debate about that issue. But you mentioned the science community, but even within the science community, you have Harvard astronomer Avi Loeb, who also claims that this interstellar comet that came in by the name of Omar Moa, that was an alien spacecraft. And in fact, I mean, he doesn't, as far as what I have read, he doesn't just say that maybe. He actually says that it is, in fact, the most likely explanation is that it's an alien spacecraft. So how do you think about Oumuamua?
Well, you know, there's been a lot of response to Avi Loeb's claim that it's alien hardware. And most of what I hear is from astronomers who work in the field of, you know, asteroids and comets and so forth. And they think that it's nothing but a rock. But as you say, Avi Loeb thinks otherwise. A couple of aspects of that story I think that are worth mentioning is the fact that this whatever it was found on its way out of our solar system. It had already come into the solar system. It had orbited around the sun, and then it was on its way out. Now, what did it look like? Well, everybody remembers that artist's rendition where it looks like kind of a bumpy cigar, but in fact, all that you could see was a dot. It was a 1 pixel picture. So you don't really know what it looks like. You can sort of, you know, guess what it probably looks like on the basis of how the light from this thing changed with time, that sort of thing. So it was, you know, very, very scanty evidence. And all the things that Professor Loeb thinks actually tag this as something extraterrestrial made by aliens, that if you could get up close to it, you would see a little brass plate on the side, you know, made by Klingons. I mean, all those things can also be explained as the kind of phenomena that you would have for an asteroid, for example, an icy bit of rock that came from somebody else's star system. So again, you know, you don't know. You can say it's an alien craft, but you can't prove that either. And unfortunately, we'll never know about Oumuamua because, you know, it's long gone. It's out somewhere in the vicinity of Saturn now. I mean, it's that far away from the sun. And we can't catch up with it. None of our rockets could catch up with it. But we found other objects like this, and we will continue to find more of them. And if all of them, you know, we can identify as just being natural objects, then the chances that that first one was a natural object go up too. Oumuamua will forever be a mystery, but the people who I know who study these things think that, nope, it's actually alien craft. I might say, just add here briefly, Avi Loeb has gotten together a big group of scientists to try and build some equipment to look for UAPs and study them. And actually, I'm on the advisory committee for that project. And you know, they're doing a good job. I think it's a good thing that credentialed scientist like Avi Loeb, he was chair of the department after all, is looking into this because, you know, maybe people will believe whatever he finds.
All right, well, we're close to the end. So I have 2 questions. One is, what do you think will be the impact of an alien signal? Because you're a part of the SETI Institute, which looks for signals. So forget about the actual visitation. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about flying saucers. But what do you think will be the impact of an unambiguous, we definitely know it's an alien signal, not like a week after, but on a longer frame, say, for example, 100 years later or 200 years later on human society. And let me give you a scenario where we just know that it's an alien signal. We know it is technology driven, but that's about it. So what do you think there would be an impact, or we will just shrug off and start living our lives as if nothing happened?
Well, it's like learning when I was a kid that there were hippopotamuses in Africa, right? I mean, I was really fascinated by that, but it didn't affect my daily life. Maybe it'll be like that. It depends also on how close by the transmitters are. You know, if they're 100 light years away, which is much more likely than they're only 10 light years away, you know, if they're far away, I mean, you can't even hope to get into a conversation with them because it takes too long for a signal to get to them and their answers to get back to us. So, you know, you can't really talk to them, but you could, of course, build much bigger equipment, bigger antennas, and try and see if you can understand what their signal is saying. Presumably it says something, right? Even if it's only advertising for soap or what, who knows, but you know, and that would be very interesting, of course, if you could somehow tune in and understand anything the aliens are saying. That might be hard, but you would certainly try, I think. But, you know, I was just going to say the real effect is that you know that, you know, there are others out there, and that's just a philosophically important thing.
But I mean, in that sense, I mean, it's also plausible that a lot more resources gets devoted, like in terms of what do we know about that star, okay, or about that planet or wherever that signal is coming from. And philosophically, as you mentioned, sort of like, you know, we will, I mean, this notion that there is evidence for another intelligent beings out there. I mean, there are a lot of philosophical questions of what kind. I mean, so it would mean that they have tools, for example, because they can use radio waves. Do you think those type of things would start impacting our intellectual foundations of societies or cultures? Or again, those would be the type of things that are more academics would be interested in and not really impact at a cultural level?
Well, I don't know. I think that it would be, you know, one of those revolutions in science that don't directly affect the population, but in subtle ways do. I mean, think of 500 years ago when Copernicus says, you know, the Earth is not really the center of the universe. The sun is. No, he was wrong about that too. But you know, but it wasn't the Earth in any case. And you know, what happened to the average person? I mean, how did their lives change? They probably didn't change very much. I mean, they still did whatever they were doing for their jobs. But on the other hand, it placed them in the cosmos in a different way, and they realized, gee, we're not maybe the center of everything. That's sort of been a leitmotif, a theme of science for, well, half a millennium now. We're not in the center. And this would tell you, well, you know, okay, Earth is not special in terms of its location in the cosmos, but by the way, you are not special in terms of our position in the universe of living, thinking beings. And, you know, I don't know that would affect my job, but it would affect my attitude.
All right, well, thank you very much. Last question. And this is about, like, you know, your interest in films. And so, I mean, often, like, you know, I ask this question in general. If there was one science fiction film that you would ask people to see, what would it be?
Well, I would feel guilty about asking them to see any film that I like. But you know, I think the one that made the biggest impression on me, you know, there were a lot of them, and mostly they involved giant lizards or ants or stuff like that. But the one that I saw as a kid, and I saw it many times afterward, that made the biggest impression on me was the original War of the Worlds from 1954, made by George Pal, where the Martians come to Earth and, you know, they try and destroy Los Angeles. Maybe not such a bad idea, I don't know. But in any case, that made a big impression on me because it was really scary.
Wow. And we have talked a little bit about that. And I also participated in SETI Astronomy Night for Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So we talked about sort of like, you know, movies at that time. But this is wonderful.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I hope that the people watching got something of interest for them out of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out and for talking about aliens and UFOs and critical thinking for audience who speaks Urdu, but with subtitles, they will also be able to watch this. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.